And here we are, ep- episode 21.
21, yep. How's it
So
going,
you've
Rob?
just woken up. Sorry, go on.
How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. So it's late in the evening here. I've had quite a
hmm
busy day. It's right at the end of the weekend. It's Sunday night when we normally record. Yes, just had quite a busy weekend doing various things. In the last couple of weeks, I've been prepping for a couple of trips I've got relating to men's rights. I'm speaking at a conference in New Zealand, the Men's Summit, which is in September, early September. I believe the date is the 9th, actually. And so Saturday, the 9th of September. And I'm also speaking at ICMI 23, which is in India. And that's September 30 through to October 2. I don't know exactly which day I'm speaking yet, but anyway, so I'll be there for the entire conference and also be having a little bit of a look around Mumbai and I think it's pronounced Pune as well.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, we've heard about the India one, so I don't think I've heard about the New Zealand one. I don't know if you've talked about it before, but can you talk to me about the New Zealand conference?
sure. So yes, and also too, we'll be publishing stuff on AVFM relating to both of these conferences and another couple of ones as well. So the New Zealand conference has been going on for many, many years. It's the first time I was approached in 2020 and invited to speak, and I was all set to go to New Zealand and speak at their conference, and it got cancelled along with everything else. I think that one, I can't recall. I think I may have spoken online in that one, but anyway, in a subsequent conference, yes, that's right. That's right. I did speak online in that one, and then a subsequent conference, I did speak online as well. And basically, ever since 2020, I've been sort of trying to get over to do one of their conferences. A lot of people don't know both Australia and New Zealand really locked down hard in terms of external access. The fact that both are essentially islands. Australia's an island continent, but New Zealand, a couple of large islands. And the fact they're both island nations means that they can lock down very hard and did. New Zealand even stricter than Australia. And so anyway, yeah, so it's 2023 and I'm finally able to go and physically present in front of the conference. So it's a one-day event each year. Yeah, really good little event they've got going there. So looking forward to, I've known the people there for a number of years now. I'm really looking forward to meeting them in person too.
Sounds good. Is there going to be footage?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Yes, yes.
That's good.
And yeah, we'll have more on AVFM about that.
Awesome.
And of course, ICMI coming up in September, October 2023.
hmm
Looking forward to that. I've never been to India. I have traveled in the developing world a little bit, and I had a little bit of a chat to Anil Kumar, who's organising the conference, and he was giving me some tips, and there were things that I recognised from having travelled in other parts of the developing world. So yeah, that'll be fun. Looking forward to it. And I believe that Anil is giving some tips to other people coming from Western countries to India as well, sort of things, how things can be a little bit different in India. So that'll be useful for anyone coming to the conference.
Sounds good. Okay. All right, so what do we have on our list of stuff to talk about today?
Well, I think we had a comment on one of our videos, which is the comment itself is probably pretty typical of what we see from feminists. And we discussed before what we were going to do about this, whether we respond or just ignore them because most of the time we don't bother responding. But this time I thought, let's have a chat about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we get your troll comments and such, but there was enough thought put into this that we are going to tear apart that thought and it'll be fun. All right.
Yeah.
So, should I say who this is by? Some person by the name of Witwiki. Okay. All right. So this is on our last video. This is on our episode 20. This was some feedback left to us. All right, here we go. This is ridiculous. There is no such things as quote unquote male spaces here in Sweden. So it's a Swedish fellow, I think. Fathers already take out 35% of all parental leave, and more women are joining traditionally male-dominated professions such as medicine, pharmacy, law, or even becoming police officers and soldiers, deconstructing the patriarchy and being able to pursue whatever life path one chooses is in women's, men's, and in all genders' best interest.
Well, there's so much to talk about there. Shall we start?
Yeah, let's do it. All right, you first.
All right. So, hi, Witwiki. Thank you very much for your comment. We really enjoyed it. So, this is ridiculous. This is where he started. Okay. Well, let's talk about the particular aspects of that you mentioned. I will say that most feminists do tend to be, and I'm not saying you're actually a feminist. It may not be. You may be a feminist. You may be a feminist ally, or you may not identify with feminism at all. Although I would probably say you're probably pro-feminist from your comments. A lot of feminists are not really very well informed on these topics, and I do hope that you do spend the time reading about it and looking at and listening to what we say, and reading further material. And by all means, continue to challenge us, because one thing that's fundamental in men's rights is it's all about free speech and independent inquiry. So we encourage you to look into the topic, and if you think there's something flawed in what we're saying, by all means, leave further comments. So I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Vernon, or I was just going to jump in and talk about male spaces.
Yeah, well, let's start there to be sure, because, well, for one thing, well, actually, what's one thing I'm just thinking about right now, this seems like a form of gaslighting, because, you know, we keep on invading these male spaces and see, no spaces, no male spaces. You know, it's like men are not meant to have spaces. So that's probably the perception one can derive from this one if you're kind of looking from the outside in here.
So I must admit that did give me a little bit of pause when I first read that, and I actually had to read it over a couple of times, because it's not unusual for feminists to claim that men's spaces are not being invaded, and that's a comment that I've seen a number of times recently when I've talked about men's spaces. I'll normally say men's spaces rather than male spaces, by the way. But in this case, Witwiki seems to have argued that male spaces don't exist, so I must admit I had to read that over a couple of times. Now I will concede, it's Swedish is probably your first language, English is probably a second language, so if that's not what you meant, by all means, come back and point that out. And we do concede that, you know, we don't have an unfair advantage in debating with someone who has some English as a second language. So if there's been any misunderstanding there, then yeah, you're welcome to clarify that. Anyway, okay, I think it's pretty self-evident that men's spaces have existed in the past. I mean, men's clubs are very, very common. So in fact, after I was challenged recently on whether men's spaces are being invaded or not, I started compiling a list of men's spaces, and I'm far from complete because there's a lot of them. And I was making note of dates when they were actually when they were actually invaded. So here's just a few that I've got on my list. As I said, I've been quite busy with various things, both in personal life and in relation to men's rights over the last couple of weeks, and I haven't completed this list. But I am tapping away at it. So in 1981, the Reform Club, this was a long-standing British club, which I think dates from the 19th century, as a lot of these clubs do, opened its doors to women. That was very much a men's space until 1981. Now, Reform Club is actually quite famous. It's, as well as being a very well-known club in London, it's actually the place where Around the World in 80 Days starts and finishes. It's actually the story was actually set starting the Reform Club, and then he goes around the world and he arrives back at the Reform Club.
Right.
So that was 1981. Lions Club International admits women as members, 1987. Rotary admits women, 1989. United Oxford and Cambridge Club, 1996. And then I've got some more recent ones. Girls are allowed to become Cub Scouts in 2018. Now, women had actually been involved in certain aspects of Scouts. Scouts, of course, were traditionally, after they were started, were a men's and boys' organisation. There was, I think, starting in the 1970s, women were allowed into. There were some parts of the Scouting movement that had no equivalent in Girl Scouts, and so women, like the Venturers, I think they are, and the higher level ones, women were allowed into those areas on the basis that there was no equivalent in the girls' area. But starting in 1996, 2018, I should say, we had girls entering Cub Scouts, which of course is the entry level. Now, another one here in my home state of Queensland, in Australia, there's a very well-known Australian club by the name of Tattersalls Club that had been a men's club. Tattersalls admitted women in 2019. There have, in addition to that, there have been a number of other clubs here in Australia and the UK which were traditionally men's clubs, which have admitted women. There have also been a large number of other clubs which have admitted, which have had votes to admit women, which have not succeeded, but have come very, very close to succeeding. And it's very, very likely that they'll probably succeed within the next 5 to 10 years because they were very close. A lot of them were just below 50% and all that sort of thing. So it won't take much to push those over. In contrast, there are a number of women's clubs, including a local club to me, a women's club called the Morton Club, which is far more exclusive than Tattersalls Club ever was, but it's women only. There's been no men have challenged entry, have tried to enter there. So there's many women's clubs and many women's spaces which no men have gone in. Of course, as we know, more recently, trans women have been entering women's spaces. Right. Back in the US, there have been 3 very famous secret societies. I love saying that because they're supposed to be secret societies, but their existence is well known, and in fact, their membership is often well known too. So they're not doing so well with the secrecy anymore. Scroll and Key, Skull and Bones, and Wolf's Head. Actually, I may have mentioned those in the previous one.
Yeah, you have, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, those are all men's spaces. I think I may have mentioned some of those others. They're all men's spaces. So I'm a little surprised, and there are plenty of other men's spaces as well. I'm a little surprised to see someone claiming that men's spaces don't exist, but
let me throw in a very obvious one: the Boy Scouts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
That's right. Which is what I was saying with the Cub Scouts, which of course is the entry level. But yes, that's right. More generally now, the Boy Scouts, you're right, have taken in girls, which the Girl Scouts have then complained about because it's now drawing away their membership from, and the Girl Scouts were then drawn. It was now a split between girls who wanted to join the Boy Scouts and girls who wanted to join the Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. Now here in Sweden, Witwiki continues. I find that particularly interesting. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in Sweden by any means. Never been there, never been that far north in Europe. What I do know about Sweden, though, is that there's been some research in the last few years that's shown that Sweden was one of the countries that they looked at, and they found this result occurred. The more egalitarian a country became in terms of gender, the more you actually saw certain gender roles appear, which I thought was really
right. That's the first thing I thought about when I saw this. So.
Exactly, something well known to MRAs, but I think people outside men's rights probably aren't very aware of that. But that research what came out over the last 5 or 10 years or so, didn't it?
Right,
somewhere along there. So I've probably got it somewhere on Wiki for Men, but we know that this research does exist, and I'll see what I can. If it's not on Wiki for Men, I'll see if I can find it again.
Now, one thing I want to point out is the contradiction here. This says more and more women are joining traditionally male-dominated professions, but you just said that there are no such thing as male-dominated spaces, male spaces.
So would not male-dominated professions be a form of male space? Exactly. Maybe not a physical space, but that's right, but a professional space, absolutely. And that would imply, in some cases, then physical spaces. Right. The other point I want to make about that particular point is his examples are really interesting. Yeah. Medicine, pharmacy, law, police, and the military. Okay. What about truck driver, miner, and various other jobs that are overwhelmingly male, and mechanics, certain classes of mechanics, things like elevator mechanic and refrigeration mechanic and so forth, that are quite specialized with specialized skills. The number of women in those roles is vanishingly small. So I'd be really interested to know what his thoughts are on that sort of thing, on why we aren't seeing more women into those fields. In some cases, they've actually had affirmative action programs, and yet they don't have large numbers coming into those areas. Mining is a particularly interesting area. Here in Australia, for example, it pays very, very well. The mining industry in Australia is huge, and there are a number of towns in central Queensland, for example, where they actually have a shortage of miners, and they also have an unemployment rate which is higher among women. So there are women who aren't entering the mining arena, even though their own local town has mining jobs going to waste. So it's very interesting when we look at those professional areas. Also, I would also say that he says joining traditionally male-dominated professions. Okay, I would concede that medicine, pharmacy, and law were traditionally male-dominated. They're now, if anything, female-dominated. Certainly the law is. Medicine's probably a little bit closer. It's interesting that men are more likely to go into specialist areas. Women are more likely to become GPs within medicine too. So the general practitioner is certainly female-dominated, while a lot of the specialties are probably still more male-dominated. The other one is veterinary science as well, that shifted, certainly from when I went to university, when a minority of probably a small, less than half of vets were women, vet students, and now it's very much more than half.
Right. Yeah. So if you're going to make a claim that there's no such thing as male spaces, you should be able to make the claim that there's no such thing as female spaces either. But who wants to guess? Who wants to bet that female spaces is something that this person would be more inclined to defend the idea of for the most part? Exactly. No, I could be wrong. I don't know.
And that's not true. Witwiki's welcome to come in and clarify that. But my suspicion also would be that Witwiki would probably defend female spaces. Yeah, absolutely. And thus accept that they exist. And that they're being invaded by trans women. So,
right.
Police and military are interesting. So I don't know what the proportion is in Sweden. Here in Australia, the proportion of women who are police, or the proportion of police who are women, I should say, has been growing, but it hasn't been growing that quickly, I don't think, and certainly not in the army. There've been, I think, some affirmative action programs, or at least encouraging the military to take on more women. In fact, the British, or the Royal Air Force, which of course is the British the Air Force of the United Kingdom, has been caught out recently that there was a campaign essentially to encourage more women and minorities to join, and an email was sent in which I think, I have to look at the exact wording, but the person who sent the email, who was the head of a recruiting section, said some fairly, who was a man, by the way, said some fairly disparaging things about essentially white male members of the RAF. It's since been clarified by the RAF that he wasn't trying to disparage the individuals, but sort of trying to argue for more diversity or something along those lines. It was very, very pleasing to see, not in the sense that the person subsequently lost her job, but there was a woman who was senior in the RAF who actually resigned in protest over this, and basically said it was completely unreasonable to be attempting to recruit people on the basis of gender in this manner. And she resigned in protest, which I thought was really admirable. I do hope, it's unfortunate she's lost her job, obviously, but I think it showed integrity. I've got her name on Wiki for Men as well, so I don't recall it right now. So,
the last part of this, yeah,
exactly. Any further thoughts on jobs before we move on to deconstructing the patriarchy?
Well, I thought we already did that, deconstructing the patriarchy thing, because we established that there's never been really such a thing in that sense, right? We've talked about patrilineality, we talked about matrilineality, and all that kind of thing. But, of course, this is talking about deconstructing the patriarchy that this person thinks exists, as prevalent, and is oppressing all women.
Indeed, if it doesn't exist, we need to deconstruct it. So Witwiki would be happy that the patriarchy not existing, surely, because it's not oppressing women, and he doesn't have to spend his time deconstructing it.
Right, exactly. So, well, if there's no such thing as male spaces, then why bother deconstructing?
That's right. So I've written and spoken a lot on the patriarchy. Before we go on, I want to yet again emphasize I always discourage the use of the term patriarchy theory for a few reasons. Firstly, it gives it far too much credence. Calling something a theory actually is saying it's got some evidence behind it, which is probably not how a lot of people use the term, but that's what it really means. And so I would never call it patriarchy theory. Yeah. And secondly, I've actually seen feminists weasel out of having to justify it because of that, because they say, I don't know what patriarchy theory is. That's something you came up with. And then they get to weasel out. So call it what they call it, the patriarchy, which Witwiki did. So thank you for doing that, Witwiki. I'm so glad you did that, because that's certainly what I will call it. So it's interesting to try to find definitions of the patriarchy. Well, feminist sites aren't very good at definitions, by the way. Feminism tends to be very waffly with definitions. I spend quite a lot of time trawling their sites, trawling their sites, looking for definitions and so forth. And when I find them, I transcribe them and usually do a screenshot as well. So because it may change later. So I actually want their definitions. And when often they didn't have them. I think they've been more they had so that they have been having them, but they do tend to be quite waffly too. They're not sort of quite succinct. Compare A Voice for Men or Wiki for Men, where you'll find a lot of definitions there. The terms we use, we clearly define them. There's a glossary actually on A Voice for Men, where a lot of the terms that common terms are. There's a longer glossary on Wiki for Men as well, where we talk about a lot of different terms, and we include feminist terms in the glossary as well, because even though they're not going to define their terms, we define them based on what they're doing.
Yeah, they don't have a fixed definitions. They have a rate of change when it comes to the definitions. You can have like an applied calculus class based on how often their definitions change.
Which takes us back to feminist maths. There you go. That's right. Which is a real thing, by the way, for those who don't believe me. Feminist maths is a real thing. Look at it for Wiki for Men. There's also feminist physics, and there was an attempt at a feminist programming language as well. So
I know exactly the programming language you're thinking of. I forgot the name of it, but there was some, because I'm a programmer, and I think you are too. We can kind of...
We had a good chuckle over that one, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right. So, I think it was something about classes, because we've got things like private and public classes, and I think it's more Marxist than just feminist. But it was just taken apart. You can't have like a class because that's like class warfare. I don't know. There was some stuff like that. I'm not remembering exactly.
There was also a feminist one. It was explicitly feminist as well. Okay. So we've got so much to write about that sometimes I make notes. I've got to come back to this stuff, and sometimes it can take me years to come back to it.
Okay, well, we need to do a better job at like preparing this stuff for a show, because there's too much stuff that we're leaving out here.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, absolutely, that's right. And let's let's see. Next time we'll talk about. I think we've talked a little bit about the feminist math. I've got info on feminist physics. Now I'll see if I can dig up the stuff on feminist, and we'll try to find Marxist programming languages. I mean, for those who don't know, those aren't in IT, there are some pretty esoteric programming languages out there. Some people write these things for fun, but I'm not sure that the feminist programming language, as described, could be implemented in a Turing machine. But anyway, we'll see how they go. Now, patriarchy. So what my sense particularly over the last few years, over the last 3, 4, maybe 5 years, this is that they've really changed the definition. Now, I'm going to give you a definition in a minute. That is the definition I've come up with based on reading many feminist sources. Okay, so I don't think it's a definition that any feminist site has presented, but I have read many feminist sources, and I think this is a definition. If I've distilled all their waffle, and this is the definition I've come up with. Now, they have also come up with a weaker definition, and my supposition is that they're maintaining the rage of the older definition and talking about injustice and oppression of women, but then using the new definition to try to justify their position, because the older definition is so difficult to justify. I think we've had quite a lot of success at damaging it. So I'll read both definitions, and that's my supposition anyway, that they're using the old definition. So they're using the rage from the old definition, they're using the new definition, and these two are not compatible. They're not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the old definition, I think that this is what a feminist typically would have said about patriarchy 5 years ago. And I've looked at things. One side is the London Feminist Network is one site. There have been a number, Everyday Feminism and so forth, a number of other sites, and I've distilled it out of this. A system, patriarchy is, according to feminists, a system in which men systematically oppress women through the use of violence. Now, I will concede some of the more moderate feminist groups will drop the explicit reference to violence, but they'll still imply it. But the key terms are systematic and oppression. So it's systematic oppression of women. It's not just oppression of women, it's systematic oppression of women, structural and so forth. That's what they're arguing.
Right.
So the weaker definition, and this one I believe I did pull off a feminist site recently. I go back to the patriarchy page on Wiki for Men.
Yeah.
If I just quickly check to see if I have a citation there. Looks like I don't have oh no, it's taken from the English Wikipedia page. That's where I got it. So the English Wikipedia page for patriarchy begins by defining patriarchy in this manner. Patriarchy is a social system in which men hold power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. Now, if we take that definition, that pretty much describes our society. It is true that men are predominant in positions of power, predominate in roles of political leadership. Yes, in most countries, men are a majority of politicians. That's not necessarily true in Rwanda, by the way, but that was because of the Rwandan genocide, which was mostly about killing men.
Right.
Moral authority, yes, in the sense that certain roles within society, that one I'm going to question a little bit more. Yes, in the sense that certain roles, like religious roles in Western countries, were predominantly male leaders. However, women have had a huge amount of moral authority in at least Western civilization, going right back to the Middle Ages, and that's something that Peter Wright has talked about extensively. You can look at his site, gynocentrism.com, and you can also look at Purple Motes. Both sites talk about that a lot. And this is something I just want to say too, that the concepts we're presenting require people to understand a lot of this stuff. And that's why we can't, the feminists will throw something like this out and that's the end of it. But we're saying, if you want to understand this topic, you're going to have to spend months longer really reading about these topics. And a lot of people can't be bothered, and they just think of it in a very light sense, and they don't really think past these sort of definitions that feminism feeds them, or these ideas. But the information is out there, but it will take you a long time to really understand it all. Right. Social privilege, again, that's another one I'd probably have a little bit more of it's probably a little bit more questionable. There have been social privileges that men have held, but there certainly are many social privileges that women hold and continue to hold today and held in the past. And control of property. So that's something that has been common in the West. That's to do with, as we said last time, patrilineality. Western civilization is patrilineal. There are societies, that's, by the way, the definition of patrilineality, essentially, that patrilineality says power and wealth flow down the male line. In a matrilineal society, power and wealth flow down the female line. So in a matrilineal society, women control property, and this is demonstrated. There are various Native American groups that were patrilineal, and it's very clearly established that the women controlled the property, the land, and so forth. Ancient Egyptian society was matrilineal, and so you had women in that society. You had women the flow of the property down the line, but the men tended to manage it day to day, but it was still a matrilineal society. So it does, I guess, it does show that it can get complicated there. But certainly in Western countries, the men absolutely controlled the property from certainly Middle Ages onwards. That would probably be the start of any society you could call Western. There is a concept called coverture, which was something that was prevalent from the Victorian era. And basically, men managed their wives' property. So in most cases, the men didn't subsume control of it, but they did manage it. If the women got divorced, they would generally retain control of their property, and they would generally retain ownership and would get back control of their property. So, we've basically got a wide variety of civilizations there. But in terms of Western civilization, absolutely, that you've got men controlling property and being predominant in political leadership. But it's a very weak definition. That essentially what they've done is that they've even said things like predominate in roles of. So that's conceding that there can be many women in positions of power. And one of the key points I make in a lot of my work and in the book I'm writing is that there were a lot of women historically who were involved. Yes, they were in a minority, absolutely, but there were many women who were in direct had political roles, and also had direct day-to-day control of property as well. So, yeah, I think using those terms like predominate have just very much weakened the definition. So if patriarchy is only about those things, why all the rage? What we're seeing is the rage of the old definition, but the new definition being quoted by feminists, and you can't have both. So you tell me which one it is. If it's the new definition, then sure, okay, patriarchy is actually a fairly weak term, but then why have all that rage? If rather it's the old definition and you're saying that women were being oppressed, then why are you quoting the new definition?
Exactly. And more regards to patriarchy. So, this is the same society, supposedly patriarchal society, that, you know, we would say that behind every great man, there's a great woman, of course. It's like a very strange kind of self-defeating version of patriarchy that I've ever heard.
Indeed, which it tends to imply then that's right that women were managing things behind the scenes, at least to some extent. Maybe have been talking about women supporting men as well, but I think there has to have been a lot of input there, and that is of course something we do see in societies historically, that there were a lot of women. There were some women who were in the front with what could be described as hard power, but there were a lot more women who were in the back who have what could be called soft power. There were lots of women who had the ear of the king. There's actually something called the Sultanate of Women in the Ottoman Empire. And it's actually a period, I think, around the 16th or 17th century, when the Sultan became so weak that basically his mother and his wife and a couple of other women were running the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. But the Sultan was still the Sultan, but he'd become a figurehead. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Right. So speaking of this, this great behind is a great woman thing. I got a funny tweet from Janice Fiamengo recently. A funny from my comments section. If it's true that behind every great man is a great woman, is it also true that there's a bad woman behind every bad man?
Oh, that bites, doesn't it? That's right. Yeah. And you know, I hadn't really thought about that, but probably, yeah. Actually, if we look at, there are a bunch of very many poor kings through history, and I'll give you an example in a minute. It could be, since in most cases their wives were advisors, and they've actually got bad advice. In actual fact, I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Ethelred the Unready. Have you heard of him? If you're not the history that I am, no, that's right. He's an English king from the English, not British king, from 9th century or something along those lines. So anyway, his name's a bit of a misnomer because at the time the word unready would actually translate today as ill-advised. So he's actually Ethelred the ill-advised, as in Ethelred who took poor advice, right? But it's actually a pun that is lost on us because his name Ethelred means well-advised. So he's well-advised, the ill-advised, yeah. So in the 9th century, it was probably really funny. Yeah.
It must have been.
Exactly. But I hadn't really thought about it before. But in actual fact, I mean, we had many cases where the queens were among the king's key advisors. Ethelred's wife was probably advising him. Maybe she gave him some bad advice. I never thought of that before, but I have to look into it. I don't even remember her name. We'll have to find out the name of Ethelred's wife and whether she was see if we have any evidence she was giving him bad advice or not. But in any case, yes, a lot of people have done jokes on that. There was actually a British show that did a joke on it some years ago and had him turning up to a battle late. Yeah, because he was getting his armor on or something like that late. Anyway, but no, it's Ethelred the ill-advised. So, yes, this is an interesting point. The women had a lot of soft power, and the queens, and this, of course, speaks to a point that I keep making in my articles and so forth. It's really about aristocracy. Powerful people, whether they were men or women, had a lot of power. Aristocratic people had a lot of power, a lot of wealth, had a lot of control over the lives of others. So an aristocratic woman would have a life that was a lot more similar to an aristocratic man than she would to a poor woman or even a woman who was in the merchant. There wasn't really a middle class in the Middle Ages, but maybe a merchant class or something like that.
Right.
The closest thing they had to a middle class. So whereas if you were talking about merchants or something like that, the men and women in that area would have a lot more. Their lives would be very similar. And by the way, there were a lot of working women, including merchants and tradespeople and so forth. So we weren't just talking about wives of tradespeople here. There were women who were swordsmiths, and there were women who were goldsmiths and tanners and blacksmiths and all the rest of it. It wasn't particularly unusual.
Right.
Yeah. We actually know plenty of plenty of cases where men and women actually met in the guild, married, and operated a small business together. And in some cases, after the husband died, the wife continued to operate the business. All sounds very modern, doesn't it?
It does, and it makes some of those fantasy settings seem not too out there. You know, maybe it is based on reality.
Exactly. That's right. Modern fantasy writers think they're probably being really edgy, including more women, but in actual fact, that's probably fairly accurate. I was watching Game of Thrones some years ago, and there was a market scene, and I actually felt there were too few markets. Now, granted, it's a fantasy world, but I actually, excuse me, I thought there were too few women in the market, I should say. Sorry. Granted, it's a fantasy world, but if they're trying to sort of replicate medieval Europe, or sort of base it on medieval Europe, there would have been a lot more women in the market than were essentially shown in the show. And I think that probably was an indication of the writers and the producers' misunderstanding about history. So food services in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance and so forth was overwhelmingly women. There were take-out places, or as we call it in Australia and the UK, takeaway, very common throughout for hundreds of years in England. And you would see these places, you would see women cooking, women serving, and it was very common for men and women to buy dinners from these places and take them home. So, and it was overwhelmingly women. So then, as now, food services were dominated by women, and many other industries had at least a minority of women.
Yeah, one thing I want to point out about food services is a bit of a off track, but because we got a lot of people in the TradCon world kind of complaining about home cooked, you need more home cooked meals. Why are you always eating out? This is not good for you. But I understand that eating out is probably maybe better back then, maybe not. Who knows? But eating out was a thing even back then, So
it was.
Yeah.
It was, and from what I have read, a lot of poor people in Middle Ages Europe didn't even have kitchens in their homes. It wasn't really; they had very, very small homes. Having a dedicated kitchen was difficult. From what I understand, it was actually pretty common for people to buy food in this manner, because the food would be produced in mass, which meant you would benefit from economies of scale. So it was probably fairly cheap, actually, compared to what else they might be doing. So this was something that was, as we said, quite common. So, basically,
it's really weird. It's like, because I hear these traditionalists kind of go on about, they have a great point about, having an intact family and everything like that. But we've also made the point that, families have been taken like various forms across history too. But, they always go on about, like the home cooked meals and stuff like that, which, home cooked meals are great, but, listening to something like this, you think that everybody back then, they all had this home cooked meal thing. They all had a kitchen. Nobody ate out.
Exactly, and that's sort of probably quite a naive view of history. These people were the same as us. They didn't have our technology, but they did it. But they, in an amazing number of ways, they acted just the same way that we do. So, one thing that was quite funny, I may have mentioned this some episodes ago, but cutlery. They used to do a lot of dinner parties in medieval Europe. And granted, I mean, I suppose I'm an English speaker. My own background is mostly from that part of the world. Actually, in my case, exclusively from that part of the world. I do have probably more knowledge of that area than some other areas. I do try to spend time researching a lot of different areas. I'm a bit weak on some parts of the Americas and so forth historically. But in terms of Western Europe, at least, dinner parties were very common. But one thing where we do have a difference from them is they didn't have the money to have cutlery. This is people who are a little bit more wealthy, so not the very poor. These people who did have kitchens, they couldn't afford to have more cutlery than they needed for the people who lived in the house. And most meals in medieval Europe were actually soups of some description with bread. That was the most common meal unless you were rich. So they would actually have dinner parties, and people would bring their own spoons, which I think is just priceless. So people would turn up for dinner and they had their spoons slung around their neck on a chain, right? Because, if you're having 6 or 8 people to dinner, you can't afford to have 6 or 8 spoons. Right? You might have, or everyone in the house, 6 or 8 spoons sitting around doing nothing when you don't need them. So, so people would turn up with their own spoons, and I guess they would wash their own spoons before they went home. I don't know. I'd hope so.
If they even did wash them, it was a rich. It was a very it was a symbol of wealth to actually use cutlery, like way back at the time, because everybody ate with their hands, their fingers, right?
The exception being soups, of course, where you needed the bowl. Although some people actually did. There were at times, people would just drink the bowl, but other times, they had the spoons. Sure. We're talking about 1,000+ years of history of medicine.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So actually, when I was in Canada, I went to a medieval show actually, and it was a sort of or I'm not say stage show, but it actually has horses. It was medieval themed, medieval times it's called actually, and you're sort of surrounding the stage. There's a number of things like that around the world. Anyway, they actually thought it was quite cute. They didn't serve any spoons by default. They expected everybody to get into the feed would pick up and drink their soup. They did admit they would give you a spoon if you really wanted one, if you asked for it.
Right.
But but we went without. Got to do it medieval ways. So, yeah.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And in places like Japan or something like that, drinking from the bowl is not horribly uncommon at all, especially if you're eating ramen or something like that. Which, by the way, I want to talk about ramen a bit. If you ditch the soup, you're an idiot.
Right. Okay. You want this to be a little bit of the flavor is, I guess, wouldn't it?
Well, yes. Yeah. So you drink the soup. Don't ditch the soup. You damn.
Yeah.
Speaking of bringing your own spoons, so the only modern example of bringing your own spoons I can think of immediately. So have you heard? Have you seen the cult film The Room?
No, I haven't. Go on.
Okay, it's a very impossibly horribly made film, right? That has cult status for being hilarious for that, right? It's one of those good bad movies, right? And in some showing of it, like because sometimes there'd be showings, even after all this time, because there's a cult fan base for it, and people will dress up and just go to the movie, right? So there's a scene in the movie in which there's this like a little picture frame, like a picture frame, kind of like this, in which there were just spoons in the photo, right?
Okay.
It was not explained. It was like some stock image or something like that. But every time the scene with the picture frame with the spoon was there in the background, like people would bring plastic spoons and they just yell spoons or something like that and throw it against the screen. So they bring spoons for that.
In the theater, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, right.
I was thinking, what a missed opportunity by the producers of the film, because they could have set something up in the picture and then linked it elsewhere in the story. It could have been really fun. But anyway, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, watch The Room and read the backstory behind the whole thing. It's hysterical.
I will.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen The Cube, but that's another cult film. And it reminded me when you said The Room. Actually, I initially thought that maybe that's what I thought of anyway. But if you haven't seen it, The Cube is a Canadian cult film. Absolutely fabulous. I actually saw it not long after I moved to Canada.
Okay, The Cube, or do you mean the Cube? The Cube set up series of films.
Cube, actually, it might just be Cube. Okay. Yes,
I've heard about it. Yeah, right.
Yes. Highly recommended. I've seen it a couple of times. So we've watched it here at home. It's absolutely fabulous.
Interesting. That's the suspense one, the horror suspense one.
Yeah, horror / suspense. Yeah, okay. I'm not usually into horror films actually, but the Cube. Yeah. Sorry, Cube. I should say it is actually Cube. Yeah, it's fabulous.
Okay, yeah. Generally, I'm not into big into horror films too much either. But I do want to see The Exorcist at some point. I heard it was very well done. So I'm one of those guys that haven't seen The Exorcist yet.
I watched it long ago, and funnily enough, I've also decided in the last few months I was going to find the time and actually see it again. I still haven't, so I'm glad you reminded me. I am going to see The Exorcist because I haven't seen it in a very long time.
Exactly, yeah. But I do know that Tubular Bells is the soundtrack or the theme to The Exorcist by Mike Oldfield, Tubular Bells. So I always get in touch with the music before I hear whatever pop thing it was associated with, popular thing is associated with, because the beginning of Tubular Bells is the theme to The Exorcist. So, okay. Cool. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I'll listen out for it. And also, while we're on the topic, Omen, the Omen trilogy, the original Omen trilogy, highly recommended. They're really, really good. I've actually watched the first two again in recent years, and then I'll be watching within the last year or so, I'll be watching the third again, I think, soon. So, highly recommended. From the 70s. Yeah, very 70s horror. Anyway.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm not huge into horror, especially, I think most modern horror is trash. But I mean, I think there was this movie, it's not really super scary. It's old, but there's this film called, I can't even think of the name right now. Night of something. I'll look it up. It's
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
While you're
It's the
looking,
one where this scroll gets passed to someone and they receive a curse, and in like a certain amount of time the demon is going to come and get the guy with the curse, but it has to be willingly accepted. So some people know what I'm talking about. It's like I'm really trying to think of the name. I'm blanking on it right now. It's like Curse of the something. Um,
oh, I don't know that one. Sorry, sounds like it might be all right actually.
yeah,
While you're
it's
looking
an
that
old
up,
black and white one.
okay, cool. While you're looking that up, my next suggestion is Crockhaven Farm. It's a not very well known 70s suspense thriller, supernatural suspense thriller. Highly recommended. I saw it when I was a kid. I'm just glad I saw it during the day. Anyway, I've since watched it again, and it's well worth watching. In fact, I've seen it several times. It's one of my favorite movies in that era.
Awesome. Night of the Demon. That's it.
Okay, I haven't
Yeah,
heard of that one.
that's the one. Yeah, it's interesting. It's yeah, so basically it's this kind of occultist guy that tries to show off his great magic or something like that. And it involves just passing a paper to somebody who willingly accepts it, and he is doomed to become prey in a certain amount of time, to be uh, uh, pray for this demon, of course. Yeah, and I don't want to spoil too much, but he has to be tricked into receiving the parchment again. So he's the one that ultimately gets. I just thought it was a really clever idea, and again, music is the first place that I kind of happen upon these kind of things because. Uh, I, I don't know if anybody listens to Kate Bush around our audience, but her song "Hounds of Love" samples the seance scene from that one. And one of my favorite bands, Arena, has an album called "The Unquiet Sky" that was based on the original story that the movie was based on. So that's how I find out about these kind of things, and that's the way I check them out. So it's inevitably through music that I get introduced to some of these things, and I do check them out. So
No, very cool. So, well, I think I'd like to comment on the patriarchy a little bit further,
okay, yeah,
and then continue on with that, just the last bit of Witwicky's comment.
Mhm.
So, I guess I've probably already gone over this quite a bit, and wherever you look in history, and I've been writing a book on this for about 6 or 7 years, and a lot of the material I've written in recent years has been drawn from the research I've done on the book. And one of the reasons it's taken me so long to write it is because as I was digging, I knew, because I've always been a history geek, I knew a lot of examples, but I kept finding more. In fact, all the time, they're everywhere. And in actual fact, I had to draw a line in the sand eventually about a year ago and basically say, okay, anything I find after this date will be in the second edition, because there's so much material I've found. I almost can't listen to a YouTube. I love often travel when I'm traveling, listen to YouTube videos when I'm driving, something like that. And I often can't listen to one of these videos and actually hear without an example or two coming up. It's absolutely extraordinary. And I'll have to go back later on then when I've got an opportunity and record the examples. So they're everywhere. Women were active in politics. They were active in the economy. They were active there were moral leaders. All these areas, women were not oppressed historically by men. And there's other reasons to believe that was the case, that they weren't historically oppressed. I know feminists got steam coming out of their ears now. What was the case was that all societies before ours had clear gender roles. Okay, so what we've done is abolish the gender roles. The gender roles assigned certain roles in life and certain activities to men and other activities to women. Yes, in some cases they weren't particularly fair. Sometimes they weren't fair to men. Sometimes they weren't fair to women. Sometimes the men weren't well suited. There were men who weren't well suited to the male role, and sometimes there were women who weren't well suited to the female role. And we've, as a society, have decided to abolish those gender roles. Now, that's a huge social experiment. I'm not exactly sure how it will turn out in the end. There's been certainly problems. with it up to this point. Now, as you'll see at A Voice for Men, when we do not want to enforce gender roles again, but nevertheless, there have been problems as well as some things that have worked out well as a result of freeing up gender roles. But what feminists and others tend to do when they're looking at these topics is they look at the problems that women were facing and say, okay, the women couldn't get out of this role. And then they'll look at the way, particularly often for the apex fallacy, they'll look at men who are more powerful and see how well these men were doing. There were a lot of men who were stuck in roles that were quite a problem. At this point, the feminists are saying, but patriarchy hurts men too. Okay? Let me just say that any patriarchy that doesn't benefit men is by definition dysfunctional.
Exactly. Right.
And now look back at the strong and weak definitions that I talked about earlier. The definition that feminists are now using for patriarchy is such a weak definition that it can't really be applied in the manner in which they're currently using it.
Exactly. And when they talk about patriarchy, because so the key word here is power, right? It's this big, it's said by Marxists, it's said by feminists, anyone, they always talk about power and how unjust it is. But I want to talk about power just a bit. The power that gets kind of glossed over because they're probably the ones practicing it is the victim power, because you were talking this whole time about, how women were basically more intermingled than we might think. They've been, like I said, the blacksmiths, you talked about those, stuff you think are more modern versions of fantasy, except it really did happen at the time. Yeah. So, you have to kind of pretend this never happened. Pretend that you never, had it pretend you didn't not have it as bad as you, as women, right? And establish, no, we've been victimized, we've been oppressed, this whole time. It's been patriarchy, men oppressing women, and what that is just kind of establishing power through to adopting a victim status. It sounds almost Nazi Germany, basically. We were victims of the Jews. That's how the whole party kind of basically founded itself on.
Now, that's actually a really good point. That's right, and a lot of it comes out of ignorance, as we were saying. But yes, that's a really good point. I hadn't considered that in my arguments before. That the essentially the constant victimhood, it gives its own form of power. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the fact that the feminists and other gynocentrists have kind of used this, they either say women were vastly oppressed, or they kind of sneak it in because they loosely believe it, because even the conservatives are guilty of this, saying that men have been oppressive to one extent or the other. It kind of affirms female victimhood, and women and the females derive a ton of power from this. Like power that you're not even recognizing as power. That's the real power of victimhood, power through powerlessness. That's compelling.
Yes, and it does really work into gynocentrism as well, where people are already naturally inclined to favour women in a variety of ways, and we see that when a woman is in trouble, men will leap to their defence, whether that's physically or verbally or whatever else it happens to be. And often will risk, in the case of in physical cases, will risk their lives. Now, they'll do that for men as well in a lot of cases.
Sure.
But you can see it with regard to how women are treated in the legal system even today. And it's interesting that then feminists will sometimes turn around and say that that's patriarchal too, because women are seen to be lesser and not deserve and not. They're not taking enough. They're not. The legal system is not giving them enough responsibility, and so giving them a lesser offence. While at the same time, feminists are constantly talking about this female victimhood.
Right. Yeah. The more we talk about patriarchy, it seems more non-disprovable, and because we just disprove this. We try to prove against this have evidence against patriarchy. No, that's patriarchy in its own way. We disprove that. That's more evidence of patriarchy. So there's no end to it. It's
yeah. I guess you're describing the unfalsifiability.
Unfalsifiability. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So another argument I put forward about patriarchy is I wrote an article called "The Absurdity of Patriarchy." It also is on Wiki for Men. And I took a little bit of a different tack in this particular article because there's different ways of demonstrating how rubbish it is. But essentially, what I was arguing in this case is that if you look at groups that have been oppressed and that demonstratively have been oppressed, they act in certain ways, and one of the ways they act is actually they talk about their oppression, and another way is that they actually rise up against their oppressors. And if you look, you don't see until about the middle of the 19th century, you don't really see any women claiming that women are oppressed. You do see a few people from then, from the early days of feminism with the Seneca Falls Convention and so forth. That's when you start seeing women talk about. But you don't really see Middle Ages women in places like France or England talking about themselves being oppressed by men. I think feminists would argue that's because they were so oppressed they didn't know they were oppressed or something like that. But if you look at other oppressed groups, they do talk about it, and freed members do talk about it. But another thing, as I said, that oppressed groups do is they rise up. They rise up against their oppressors. They're not always successful. Sometimes and often, in fact, their attempt to rise up is crushed because their oppressors are actually very powerful. But if I've never found a single example of women anywhere in history rising up against men and trying to overthrow their oppressors. If anyone can find a single example, I'd be interested to hear it, interested to see it. Not a single example of women, as I said, even talking about how oppressed they are and systematically oppressed here, talking systematically oppressed. Mm-hmm. And remember that because that comes back to the feminist definition of patriarchy, and then planning a widespread uprising and then executing it. Or even, it's often the case that sometimes a few people in the ruling class, the oppressors, side with the oppressed and help them. You don't really see any such uprisings occurring. I can't think of a single example. I've never seen a single example anywhere in history. As I said, I've seen many women rise to powerful roles in the society. And some of those women, by the way, as we're talking about, were often horrible to other women under their control. And in actual fact, we have talked about this before, moving on a little bit, I guess, but female rulers tended they ended up, both in medieval Europe and in the modern world, we've seen they tend to start wars and continue wars more than make wars. So in addition to everything else, we've seen that they're not less aggressive than the men.
Most certainly not. They're more unhinged, if anything.
What's it say?
They're more unhinged, if anything.
It's actually really interesting because I always assumed, I often heard feminists say, if the world was run by women, there'd be less wars and so forth. And I argued for a long time that there'd be no difference, that if we replaced all female leaders, it would be substantially the same. So I was kind of surprised to discover that there was a difference, actually, when I first came across this research probably about 10 years ago, or even less, actually, because the medieval European stuff that came out more recently than that. There was a difference, just not the one feminists were arguing, were claiming.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention one more example. I don't know if I've ever mentioned it, but I think it's worth mentioning. There are a lot of examples historically, and I've talked about them in my book, and I've talked about them in other contexts and so forth. But I want to mention Lydia from the Bible. Now, I'm not Christian. I'm not religious. The Bible is an interesting, from my perspective, the Bible's a really interesting way of looking at the particular culture. Now, the argument I'm about to make doesn't even presuppose that many of the main events in the Bible are true. I think that probably a lot of them probably are based on things that really happened. But even aside, what I'm looking at is the culture that's speaking to us through their writings. Does that make sense? Those are people in that era writing about recent events. In that case, often events that happened within the previous 100 years or so.
Right.
So the first, and I mentioned this on Twitter recently, actually, and the first person from Europe, the first European who verifiably became a Christian is a woman. Her name is Lydia, and she owned a big house, and she either ran a dye business, we don't know, or she was a really high-paid salesperson. One of the two. We don't know whether she ran the business or that she was just a salesperson. But either way, it was a pretty powerful position because she was dealing in very expensive dyes. So these were dyes, and these were essentially luxury goods of their era. So she would have been dealing with very wealthy people, kings, and so forth. These were people who wanted to buy these dyes. Then the average people couldn't afford them.
Sure.
She worked for a living. Okay, this is in a society that supposedly never let women leave the house. Okay, even though we know from the Bible that there were many female followers of Jesus. Apparently, they were allowed to leave the house. And Lydia, who became a Christian, said worked for a living. Now, she was probably also a business owner. We don't know that for sure, but she was probably a business owner. By the way, Lydia probably wasn't her real name. That may be a reference to the city she came from.
Okay, sure.
So it's probably lost to history. But again, it's not really about even whether Lydia really existed. It's about people writing about their own era and what they're telling us about their era. And they're saying, here's a woman who dealt in expensive goods and ran a big house. And they didn't think that was odd at all. They didn't. I mean, if that's something that was alien to their society, then we wouldn't have seen it writing in the book, in the Gospels. We see it there because it was something they went, yep, that's the type of thing that goes on, and that's what was going on here.
Exactly, yeah. In these kind of cases, it's probably proper to see the Bible as a collection of stories, and the stories are not at the time written as like pure fantasy. They're because like most stories, how they would be written, it would be just find something relatable, I suppose, at the time. So
exactly, that's right, and that actually reinforces the argument that it would be something people would not find particularly strange because you don't want. Yeah, it would be something, as you say, that has to be relatable. That's right. And as I said, my argument here is not based on whether the story itself is true. Mm-hmm. It's based on, like you said, what those people were saying about their own era and what was normal in their own era. And I like that argument. Actually, that's a good point.
Right, sure. And like you, I'm not the Christian here, so I'm just telling it like it is. It's like I think whether it really happened or not is probably not the best way to kind of judge the Bible, I suppose.
Exactly, that's right, and it's actually relevant to my argument as to whether it really happened. Right? It's about what they're saying about the society. There are also so there's the 4 canonical Gospels. There are also some other Gospels called the Gnostic Gospels. I think there are several dozen of them actually, and they're actually kind of interesting to read. And they don't necessarily follow the same pattern as the canonical Gospels. The canonical Gospels are the ones that are in the Bible. There was just one I was reading today actually about one of the Gnostic Gospels, and it actually had female follower. I think it was Martha is her name. She was a female follower of Jesus. Now she's mentioned in the Bible, but this Gnostic Gospel talked about her a bit more. And apparently she wasn't letting the men get a word in edgewise, and they were complaining about it to Jesus in the story. So how patriarchal is the society when this woman is basically talking over the men, and they're saying, boss, she won't let us speak. I think that was the Gospel of Thomas. I think it was written in. So yeah, I think so. I was like, yeah. How patriarchal were these societies? I mean, it seems like a very modern situation that a person might find themselves in.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So for the record, Christians don't accept modern Christians don't accept the canonical gospel. Sorry, the Gnostic Gospels. They do accept the canonical Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels. There were ancient Christians by the name of Gnostics.
Yes.
Who accepted the Gnostic Gospels. But from what I can tell, Gnosticism was very broad. And
right. Yeah. Well, I'm trying to piece together what little knowledge I have of Gnosticism, but they had this concept called the Sophia. Which Sophia is so in this case, in this context, is kind of referred to as like the female Christ equivalent, sort of. So I'm kind of talking straight off the top of my head here, but obviously, because what we do know is Sophia is a prefix for the idea. The word is a prefix for wisdom. That's where we get philosophy from. It's a love of wisdom.
Oh, I didn't realize that's where the word philosophy came from. Very good. Yes, I knew about Sophia and the link to wisdom. I didn't know about the philosophy. Very good.
Yeah. Love of wisdom, philosophy. Yeah.
In actual fact, if you think about it, there's so for Sophia, a female aspect, wisdom. In Greek mythology, Athena was born full-bodied from the head of Zeus.
Yes.
Terrible. Yes, exactly. He had a god-style headache, and then a person came out of his head, and she was, of course, the goddess of wisdom. And there was another one that I've encountered recently too. So you've got a number of examples there where societies are ascribing wisdom to a female aspect.
Right.
And these societies that were supposedly very, very patriarchal.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Also, too, and I talk about this in the book too, goddesses. I talk about Athena, and there's a few other ones too. If I think the religions reflect the societies that created them, and if a society was heavily patriarchal, you would see female goddesses being submissive and probably not too bright. Because that would be what they would want the women, how they want the women to be. So if you want to see how women are supposed to be, look at the goddesses in that society. And if you look at, say, Greek goddesses or Roman goddesses as just two examples, or other European examples, and I've looked at some other non-European examples too, what you tend to see is these sort of things. You see female goddesses of wisdom, as I've encountered a few times. Right. Goddesses of war, actually pretty common, surprisingly common. Of course, Athena was also had a military and war aspect to her.
Yes.
Yep. Along with Ares. But this is something I've seen turn up in a number of different societies. And I do think it really is a reflection of the way that those societies expected their women to act. And so not necessarily the women were going to war, but certainly the fact that was in there, I think, says something about the way those women acted in that society.
Yeah, pretty true.
So wherever we look, whether it's in religion or whether it's in, and see, Christianity itself, which many feminists would claim is patriarchal, as I said, had many, many prominent women. We've mentioned a few, but there are a lot more. Even Islam, actually. So Muhammad's fourth wife, whose name starts with A. Oh dear, I'm having a mental blank on Muhammad's fourth wife. Excuse me. Aisha. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay. Aisha. I can't believe I forgot Aisha's name. Aisha actually is a bit of a tangent. There's sometimes some people who are hostile to Islam like to claim that Muhammad was a pedophile because Aisha married him very young. We don't know how old Aisha was when she married Muhammad.
Okay.
She was probably, I believe, the experts generally estimate the range between 9 and 19. Now, it's also worth bearing in mind before I go into my main point that in general, many ancient societies the girls did not start having sex until they started menstruating. That's when they were considered to be women. So, and women, of course, tended to menstruate at an older age historically than they do today. When did Muhammad first have sex with Aisha? Absolutely no idea. Wouldn't be terribly surprised if she was 14 or 15, maybe 13, something like that. But
so the point is that even if he did marry someone that young, he wouldn't have done anything until
consummate the marriage until she started menstruating. Exactly. That was the normal state for most historical societies. So even as someone who has no connection to Islam and so forth, I'm quite neutral on the topic. I think it's pretty out of order to say that Muhammad was a pedophile. I think there were all sorts of marriage. Muhammad also, as I recall, had a much older wife who was I think had been a wife of a relative. That was pretty common too, where they would marry a woman and basically his job was then to support her. Because that was basically their social services. His relative had died and now she was a widow, and he was expected to marry her and provide her a home somewhere she could live. So anyway, that was anyway, getting back to Aisha. Aisha, I seem to recall, was an advisor to Muhammad, where he would take her opinion. And I think she was now. Muslims and others may wish to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think she was pretty much his favorite wife, actually. So. And I think she did, even though it was meant to be the case that he took advice from her. So and many would assert that Islam is very patriarchal, but I think that we see again the same pattern coming through, that there's a great men tend to take advice from their wives, and there's a lot of soft power that comes from that without the risk too. So the great thing about soft power is it doesn't have the risk. You can introduce an idea to your husband or your brother or your father, who happens to be, if you're a woman, and they're the ones really taking that direct risk and who might get themselves nailed to something if they mess up. but nevertheless, the women's ideas are certainly being introduced there.
Yeah. Well, I think this sort of, I don't want to say facade, but this appearance of, of supposed patriarchal oppression we see in like modern Islamic societies. Well, I'm just thinking like, Afghanistan, for instance, from like a couple decades back. I see like photo footage of them, and it looks closer to a Western society before they start, this kind of hijab kind of thing. It just didn't seem to be as prevalent.
Right. Was this before? Was this during the Western occupation of
I
Afghanistan?
think so. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Because you also see it in Iran before the revolution is really interesting.
Yeah. Right.
Iran before the revolution was very, very westernized. And there's great pictures of women, wearing makeup and going to dances, and you could have been Paris or London or New York or something,
Yeah.
And of course, then the revolution happened. But even then, it's a much more complicated situation than many people believe. And society is very, very complicated. These ideas like patriarchy, they're very, very simple, very simple minded. Sorry, didn't mean to say they're very simple minded ideas. Slipped out. They're very simple ideas. In fact, I had the pleasure of meeting an older woman recently who she's fluent in Farsi. I didn't know this when I first met her. She's fluent in Farsi, and she actually lived in Iran. She's Anglo. Her ancestors are, in British Isles, type thing. She lived in Iran. She married an Iranian man. She became an Iranian citizen, and she lived in Iran in the years after the revolution. Okay. And it was absolutely fascinating to talk to her. I didn't have much of an opportunity. We were just, our contact was in relation to a different sort of context. And I didn't have much of an opportunity to talk to her about this. And now I think about it, actually, I haven't seen her in a couple of years. I might actually reach out and just have a chat to her about it.
Sure.
And maybe get a little bit more info. I've actually suggested to her that she write a book about it because it's actually really, really fascinating. There were absolutely problems and all sorts of things from what she said. But what I found really interesting is she said, living as a woman in Iran after the revolution, she said, was very, very different to what the perception a lot of people have. And now I hope I'm remembering correctly, but from what my recollection is, that she said the story "Not Without My Daughter" was a bit of a travesty. So the story "Not Without My Daughter."
I was about to ask you about that. Does it really kind of?
I had to ask her when I got a chance. It was only we had a few conversations on this over the space of a few weeks. Only quick conversations because we were dealing with other stuff. But I did have a chance to have a few brief conversations with her, and I brought this up. And she basically, from what my recollection is, that she said that it wasn't at all like that, and that I don't use the word propaganda, but it wasn't at all a description of what Iran was really like. And I've actually read that from other contexts as well. That "Not Without My Daughter" was for those who don't know, the story is about there is a true story of an American woman that marries an Iranian man, and they're in the United States, and he's really lovely and so forth, and he talks her into traveling back to Iran.
Was it Iran or was it Iraq?
No, it was Iran, definitely Iran.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah.
So they lived in Tehran, and the idea was they would go back and the daughter would meet her Iranian side of the family and spend some time together and so forth. And once she was in Iran, he owned her, he owned the daughter. Initially, he wouldn't let the wife leave, who's the American woman. Then he later says, yes, you can leave, but the daughter stays. And she's not going to leave Not Without My Daughter, it's the title. Eventually, it's no spoiler because she's written a book and there's a movie. But in the story, eventually she escapes Iran and I think to Turkey, and then flees and then writes the book. So I think this lady, from my recollection, she was saying it was quite different to that. But more generally, societies are complex. The roles of men and women in these societies are complex. There are obviously restrictions on women, but there are many restrictions on men in Iran as well. That's not to say that women don't have legitimate concerns in Iran at the present time, but I think that a lot of the cases the men do too. So, I mean, the Iran-Iraq War being a classic example where the men were drafted and sent to this terrible, terrible 8-year war that a lot of people don't realize. For basically 6 years, it was trench warfare, and they had the Iraqis used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers. Many thousands of Iranian soldiers were harmed in that war from the chemical weapons. A lot more died on both sides. So there's all sorts of problems that Iranian men has as well as Iranian women. So it's very much not one-sided, and it's not about men oppressing women. I actually think it's about a theocracy oppressing the entire population, to be quite honest.
That makes sense. Yeah, right. The funny thing is, because we're talking about this, Sally Field, the actress, and Not Without My Daughter, I know her to have said, if women ran the world, there would be no wars. That she touted that fallacy.
Yeah,
so it's just a funny bit of irony there.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. It doesn't at all gel with what we know from based on actual evidence, as we said before. So, and all that information is on Wiki for Men. If anyone hears this and doesn't believe us, it's all there. The only problem I have is that there's so much of it that it's taking years to document and write it all, both for the book and for Wiki for Men and A Voice for Men and so forth. I've been at this for a decade now.
Yeah. So we need to take an example from Mystery Science Theater and have like a book with an internet uplink. So keep on. Yeah. And tablets don't count. iPads don't count. Kindle Fires don't count. I mean, like a book, like a physical book with pages with an internet uplink. We need that.
I've actually on a little bit of a different topic too. We've lost a lot of sites in the last few years. There's so much information that was useful for men's rights which has disappeared. I'm actually now taking. I have a monitoring system that monitors health of our various sites. I've actually taken to monitoring just once a day or whatever a number of sites that I don't even run, just to tell me if they fail. And if they fail, I'll get in touch with the owner, because there've been a number of sites which have disappeared from the internet, which had valuable information on them. So if you run a site like that, I urge you to think about these topics. There are many, many ways you can protect it. I'm taking steps to protect A Voice for Men, Wiki for Men, gynocentrism.com, and a number of other sites, neonatalcutting.org and so forth. One of the many ways, getting back to what we were just talking about, one of the many ways that I'm doing that is I'm actually taking subsets of that information. That hasn't happened yet. This hasn't happened yet, but will be soon. Taking subsets of that information and printing it in books through Amazon self-publishing. So Wiki for Men, there'll be a series of articles pulled out of Wiki for Men, which will be printed in book form. And the principal reason I'm doing is not to promote book sales there, although that'd be nice. It's principally to produce physical copies of this information that can survive into the future. We're more and more dependent on a digital world. I think a lot of people don't realize how tenuous that can be in some cases. If you don't know what a Carrington event is, look it up. We nearly had one in 2012. So I'll very quickly go over it. A Carrington event happened in the 1860s, and there was a large amount of solar activity to the point where telegraph operators, because telegraphs were one of the few networks that existed at the time, telegraph operators could disconnect their telegraph systems and continue operating. The solar activity was creating electromagnetic currents in the lines to the extent that they didn't need them to be connected to batteries. And a number of telegraph stations caught fire. And I think they might have been the ones still connected to the batteries. That's my suspicion. But anyway, it was a real problem, but they weren't reliant on technology the way we are. A Carrington event today, the US government estimated some years ago, and I don't think the number has changed much, it's about 15 or 20 year ago estimate, said it would take 4 to 10 years to fully recover from a Carrington event. And we just missed one by 9 days in 2012. So it could happen. If I keep offline backups, they may not even be safe. If it was bad enough, certain offline media like hard drives could still fail if it was bad enough. You could keep backups in a Faraday cage or something like that if you really wanted to survive. But another way, as I said, I've got a lot of online backups and offline backups, but the backup to the backups will be printed documents. If it was bad enough or there was some sort of civilizational collapse, I want this information to survive, and we'll have printed information available. And there'll be what my plan is to have copies printed and stored around the world. So I'll get a copy, Vernon, I'll get you to get some copies and so forth and store them, have other people store them in Europe, so that there'll be, if one area of the world is destroyed, that information can still survive. Yes, I spend a lot of time thinking about disaster recovery and backups and so forth, and business continuity planning, all that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And I've incorporated all that into A Voice for Men. We have multiple, in A Voice for Men, we have multiple levels of backups for our data. We have offsite backups, we have cross-regional backups and so forth. So, and soon, printed copies of the information.
Great.
Anyway, but I do want to emphasize, if anyone's listening and you're running a men's rights or an anti-feminist site, please give some thought to this. If you feel out of your depth or you need some help, come talk to me about it. This is something that I've worked on for decades, and I'm happy to talk to people about that. Happy to talk to people on our side of the fence about supporting about saving your information.
Yeah, sounds good.
Well, we haven't even got to Lauren Southern.
Yeah, are we still talking about that? We've been going on for almost an hour and a half.
I know. I think we should leave Lauren to the next one. Lauren Southern has been a prominent person in, I guess you could say, a libertarian camp. She wasn't about the
I can debate that, but
okay, fair enough. That's good, actually, good.
But not maybe next time. Yeah,
no, that's right. From me, as someone who's, I guess, agrees with libertarianism in a lot of ways, but wouldn't necessarily call myself a libertarianist. I saw her as a prominent figure of libertarianism, so that's interesting to hear.
Sure, yeah. And this is just me being nitpicky. You know, she sneaks in a lot of non-libertarian ideas for me, but that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and she was for a while quite prominent in anti-feminism. She was somewhat supporting men's rights for a while. She didn't do that later on, and I wrote an article quite critical of something she said back in 2019, I think it was, as well as a couple of other people, Sydney Watson and Daisy Cousins. I've met both Sydney and Daisy, as I said at the time in the article, and I was a little personally disappointed by what was said. It wasn't about me in particular, but it was about the manosphere, which I think included men's rights. And since I met both of them, they know my involvement. I was a little bit disappointed on a personal level. I have never met Lauren Southern. However, I know people who know her, and I was also disappointed by what she said. Anyway, she's come out with a video recently where she's taken quite a bit of a different tack. I would encourage people to listen to it. I didn't think I'd listen to the whole thing. I skipped a couple of bits where I thought she was waffling a little bit, but listened to pretty much the whole thing. Anyway, next time I think we should talk about that in depth. I think it'd be interesting.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll probably actually have to watch it first.
Yeah, great. So that's right, because I think we talked earlier. That's right. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thank you. It has gone for an hour and a half. We've talked about a lot. I hope Mr. Witwicky
it is a Mr.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I'm assuming Witwicky is male and calls himself a feminist ally. If that's not true, Witwicky, by all means, post a comment and clarify whether you're male, female, consider yourself gender fluid, or if you don't want to say, and whether you call yourself a feminist or an ally. I never call someone a feminist unless I've heard them call themselves a feminist at least once, and certainly not if I've heard themselves renounce feminism. So Michael Flood is a well-known figure here in Australia. I generally refer to Michael as a feminist ally, which I think he probably is reasonable. Would probably consider to be reasonable. I've never heard Michael Flood refer to himself as a feminist. So if he has ever referred to himself as a feminist, if anyone knows of an example of that, I'd be interested to know. If he has, I'll happily call him a feminist. But yes, same with men's rights. I never call someone an MRA unless I've heard them refer to themselves that way.
Exactly.
So I'm quite strict with definitions, yes. Yeah. Thank you. I think we've had a great discussion.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Yeah.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you then. Bye-bye.